Hey everyone, welcome to Serious Coin. This is the podcast where we have rich conversations about wealth. I'm Kelly Willis-Green. What does it mean to be rich today? You know, I remember over 20 years ago, early in my career in wealth management, we had a client who had just sold his business for about $30 million. And he came to us and asked, "Am I wealthy?" Because he knew all kinds of people who it seemed to him were spending like they were rich, and he wanted to know where he now fit in the high net worth hierarchy. We're all curious, aren't we? We're curious about how much others have, how much they spend, how their lifestyles compare to ours. And that's what this episode is all about. A window on who and what constitutes wealth today. I'm talking to Winston Chesterfield, founder of the Barton Group, a strategic consulting firm focused on wealth and the luxury sector. His entire work is about studying, interviewing, and understanding the super rich. And in my conversation with him, we talk about the different tiers of wealth and its expression in lifestyle, behavioral traits, and spending habits. Winston joined me from his home in London, and we got started by defining what exactly are the different categories of wealth.
The first tier is defined as those with more than $1 million US. And if you take that entire group, including all of the other sub-tiers as well that we're going to talk about, that total population now is around about 37 million around the world. So there's 37 million people there or thereabouts with more than $1 million US. And that includes everyone from just $1 million net worth all the way up to Elon Musk at the top with hundreds of billions. So it's a very small, when you consider the fact the population of the earth is around 8 billion people. When people talk about the 1%, it's not really the 1%, it's less than 1%. It's of 0.4%. Basically broken down into around 4 or 5 tiers. The first tier is 1 to 5 million. And these are they're defined by the wealth industry as being just high net worth. That's the overall definition of that group. Then there's a group between 5 million and 30 million. And this group is termed very high net worth. This is a group that's characterized by the fact that at that level, your net worth of $5 million plus, you start to break into a lot more of a diversified wealth profile. And whereas with the 1 million to 5 million set, typically a lot of that is in first and secondary properties, so real estate, and in some cash and savings and some investments and pensions. That's really where a lot of that 1 to 5 is. When you're looking at 5 to 30, that's where you start to see much more advanced investments and diversification of how that wealth is held.
And how many in that segment?
So in that segment, there's about 3.9 million around the world. Then after that, you've got the 30 million to 100 million crowd, which is known as the ultra high net worth audience. And this is the one that gets a lot of press. It gets a lot of discussion because in this group of 30 million plus, you've got a lot of very wealthy people worth hundreds of millions, people worth billions. But these days, we tend to break down the ultra high net worth audience into 2 groups. One's 30 to 100 million, and one's 100 million plus. And typically, this is because 100 million plus, that's where you start to see people have their own family offices. We think there's around 334,000 people in the world who are worth between 30 and 100 million. And remember, the total population of the world, about 8 billion, 334,000 people worth 30 to 100 million. So very, very, very small. And then 100 million plus is obviously smaller again. And there's around 90,000 people in the world who are worth more than 100 million. So essentially, that's a college football stadium size. Mm-hmm. And that puts it into context, that number of people who are worth more than 100 million out of the entire population of planet Earth, it's incredibly small. So as you go up that pyramid, as you can imagine, the populations grow smaller. And at the top, there's around 4,000 billionaires or so. So within that 100 million group, you take out 4,000 people who are dollar billionaires. And then there's roughly around at the moment, there's been a new category created, but there's only about 5 or 6 members of it currently, which is the center billionaires. And at the top of that, you have Musk and Bernard Arnault. But you also have people like Mark Zuckerberg, you have Bill Gates is in that group, Warren Buffett. It wasn't that long ago, people were talking about just billionaires and people worth, 20, 30 billion were the richest people in the world. Carlos Slim, 10, 15 years ago, was one of the richest men in the world with around 20 odd billion. Now you're talking the wealthiest people in the world being 10 times that amount. It's grown incredibly in terms of its base camp and its peak.
And it's also not that long ago. That billionaire figure actually surprises me. I remember 2,200 billionaires, 2,500, you're saying now 4,000. So the amount of wealth creation has been fantastic.
It has been. A lot of this has been driven by two countries. Number one, China has created huge numbers of billionaires in its own country because it's gone through, as you know, an economic and an industrial revolution, very similar to the Gilded Age United States, where enormous fortunes have been made out of manufacturing, out of industry, out of real estate, because of the growth of the country's wealth. And America, the second country is America.
Yeah.
It's been the most important wealth creating country for the last 150 years.
Yeah, I think I read UBS came out with a report the other day. 40% of the world's billionaires are in the US.
Yeah.
And the other thing that was reported was that for the very first time, Nepo billionaires outnumber self-made billionaires.
Yeah.
So what do you understand about the various sources of wealth of these centimillionaires and billionaires if we focus on those segments?
Well, I mean, it's interesting. So if you take the ultra high net worth as a total group, so 30 million plus, around 80% or so have actually made their own wealth. And that's when you take in the whole group, 30 million plus. You do see that fall a bit as you get up to sort of 100 million plus. So when you get over 100 million, you start to see creeping more towards around 65% all self-made. And then you see sort of mixtures of a little bit self-made, a little bit inherited. And then when you get up to sort of 500 million, you start to see it's sort of split off. That's where you start to see quite a significant amount has been inherited. And then an equal chunk has been completely self-made. And in the billionaire field, some of the biggest fortunes in the world have not been created in, most of them have, the biggest ones haven't been created in the last 5-10 years. And there's a few exceptions. Obviously, people like Elon Musk is a great exception to that. Bernard Arnault is actually a completely self-made man. But when you think about some of the other people in that, so the members of the Waltons family, for example, or the Mars family,
right?
These are multi-generational businesses. And the Walton family have many members who are representative of the top 50 wealthiest people on the planet. And so as you go up, you start to see a lot more of an even keel between people who just inherited absolutely everything and people who have made it. And I think a lot of that is to do really with the fact that the fortunes we're talking about at that top end are so hard to achieve at that height of a fortune, because you have to have a lot of things going for you. You have to have the timing has to be perfect. Your idea has to be absolutely perfect. You have to be a ruthless person. You have to be liked as a person to get on with people, to get on with businesses. So all these things have to come together, and it's very rare that happens. And I think that's one of the reasons why at that level, there's so many people who have just inherited their money at that level rather than making it themselves.
Ruthless and the ability to get along with people? How's that for an oxymoron? But I was interested in Winston's take on the personality characteristics of the richest of the ultra-high net worth group. And while he and I agreed that they're not a homogenous group, he did suggest that many of them have two other characteristics that may explain their success.
For the self-made wealthy people, I think that they're a slightly distinct group. People who have made their fortunes themselves. The characteristics that are most common that we see amongst that group are that they are borderline obsessed with what's going to happen. There are many people who live very, very ordinary lives in the world who don't necessarily care about what's going to happen. The big characteristic trait that is shared amongst the self-made ultras is that they are very, very focused on what's going to happen, where the world is moving to, what is going to happen geopolitically, and making predictions and having huge concern about that more than almost anything else. That's the biggest trait I think that they share, whether they are an industrialist, whether they're in financial services, whether they are, into sports franchises. That is the thing that really combines lots of them together in terms of what they share amongst each other. I think the other thing that really is a characteristic trait that we also see amongst people that we actually interview and we speak to a lot is a sense of realism. These people are mostly, when they're on their way up, they're not interested in what we'd call sort of superficial signaling. So what they're much more interested in is the reality of the world, because they know that's where the success in business lies. So they will pursue things on the basis of what is real, rather than what is idealistic, what is utopian. They are highly, highly focused on the reality of the world.
All right, let's talk about their spending. Some of the spending trends, spending habits. What are they spending their money on these days?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting one. Just comparing, for example, the self-made very wealthy people with the nepos, the inheritors, we see big differences in terms of attitudes towards certain spending. So with the inheritors, what we typically see is much greater focus, well, not focus, but much greater, let's say, freedom in terms of spending. So those who've inherited it, unless they've inherited they've inherited a castle and a lot of debt and very little money, most of the time when people have inherited that level, they typically spend a lot more freely than they do if they have made it from scratch and they've come from nothing. And there's a couple of examples. I mean, Elon Musk is an interesting character because even though he's one of the wealthiest men in the world, he doesn't spend in the way that, people expect the wealthiest man in the world to spend. He actually is quite modest. He doesn't have a gigantic super yacht. Yes, he's got a Gulfstream jet he uses, but it's really practical. He spends a lot of his money on, R&D. He invested a ridiculous amount of money in buying Twitter and renaming it X. And people are mystified the fact that he's actually saying he did that to restore freedom of speech. And he's not actually making much money out of it. He doesn't really care. So these are very interesting characteristics of someone like that. And he's not alone in the fact that self-made people because they know where they've come from, they tend to be a lot more careful about how they spend. So self-made people sometimes eventually get up to the level where they would say, right, I now deserve a super yacht. I want to get a super yacht. Everyone's got one. I can easily afford one. They're meant to be really good. I've chartered one before. Let's do it. Now, definitely there are self-made people that do that. But typically we see that that's much more of a thing that happens after a long period of time. It happens usually after people have chartered for a long period. And also, I'd say it's more common amongst the nepos. It's more common amongst people who have grown up around wealth, who are used to it, who would say, "Oh, I'm happy to do all this super high-end spending, like buying, private jet hours, or buying a jet itself, or buying a super yacht, and getting and buying things probably that are slightly outsized to their net worth, just because they just feel like I should have this." That's much more common than nepos. I think the thing that's common across both groups of the inheritors and the self-made in terms of what they spend on, I think they don't really think about small levels of spending. Once you get above 100 million, you don't really think about small levels of spending very much. When we talk to people about this, we ask them, tell me the last thing you bought in terms of luxury goods. They can't really remember because everything they buy is luxury. And if they buy gifts for their children, it's always luxury. If they buy things they need for the home, it's always luxury. So they don't differentiate like, oh, last time I bought a luxury good was this. It's just a way of life for them. So that's never a special category. Cars can be if they're interested. So if they collect cars, if they buy cars, that can be a special thing for them, particularly if they are rare, unique vehicles. I think the biggest category of spend that they're most interested in is definitely travel. Travel is the big category that never goes away. It's growing and growing every single year amongst the ultra wealthy. More and more specialist agencies are being set up purely to cater for people who are high net worth, very high net worth, and ultra high net worth, to provide a more spectacular, more interesting, more private experiences in many different parts of the world. All the hotel brands that constantly open up all new hotels all the time, and expanding. Aman, Chedi, Four Seasons, they're always expanding and opening more. This is never a contracting industry. And that's partly because there is just such a fever for traveling amongst the very, very wealthy. The other category, I think, categories that are of interest are collector categories. And one of those could be, I already mentioned cars, one of them could be classic cars, but the other one that's been hot, obviously in the last few years has cooled off a bit, has been sort of horology. So watches was of interest, I think, to very wealthy people, partly sort of investment, particularly down the high net worth, very high net worth level. At the upper level, it was more about exclusivity. It was about craftsmanship. It was about pieces that they were offered to buy things that no one else in the world was offered to buy. There are ultra high net worths who are invited to Patek Philippe to have a special dinner with the family, and then they get offered a watch for sale that no one else, only 5-10 other people in the room are offered for sale that particular item. But artwork as well. Art has been it's been a category that's almost been created by the wealthy, but it's not like it's the 19th century. And back when the way in which you expressed your wealth back in the Gilded Age was through the houses you built on Fifth Avenue, the cottages you built in Newport, and the jewelry you wore at balls or cotillions. That was the way in which you expressed it. Yes, you had some steam yachts as well. There was that, but there were relatively few other ways to express your wealth. But these days, I think, travel just overall is not really an expression of wealth, amongst the super wealthy. They don't need that. They've already got the publicity for being wealthy. They already feel quite powerful. I think the way in which they express their wealth now is usually through exclusivity. And that comes through things like art. It comes through antiques and collectibles. It comes also through, foundations. It comes through supporting events. It comes through financing films, being seen alongside the likes of film stars at a red carpet event. That's the kind of exclusivity that you get now from being an ultra wealthy person who, let's say, who's plenty of whom who co-finance films for that reason, because it's fun and because they get to go to premieres and see more famous people than themselves and be a part of that world. So these are the kind of things that they play around in now. It's very, very far removed from the formal, stiff world of the balls, the mansions, and the jewelry.
I want to come back to travel because you wrote a report recently about hotels that struck a note with me.
Yeah.
I'm curious as to your perspective on the hotels, chains versus boutiques. You wrote some interesting things about loyalty schemes. They are, I think you said, anathema to this group. So talk to me about hotels.
I think when it comes to the very high net worth and the ultra high net worth, I think there's much more of an interest in places that have meaning, places that have authenticity, places that have a soul, places that have personality, places that are devoid of corporatism, devoid of that international touch, that don't have loyalty schemes, separate checking queues for people with loyalty cards. Those kind of places are sort of almost horrific to the very wealthy who are the very well traveled, because there's no sense of adventure to them. There's no sense of real detachment from where you're from. There's no sense of real connection to where you're going to and where you're staying. And I think that's what matters to them. So boutique hotels, we constantly hear from the very wealthiest, are of the most interest. Yes, some chains are very interesting. I mean, Aman comes up a lot for the very wealthiest group as a very interesting group for people. Particularly for business travel, we often hear Mandarin Oriental as well. And there are obviously some Four Seasons that people like. If you take, for example, the number one hotel in the San Pellegrino list recently, which was Passo dell'Acqua in Lake Como in Italy. And that being number one kind of just exemplifies the truly recherche type of property that the most discerning people are looking for. It doesn't have any of this corporate generic look about it. It is highly tuned to appeal to someone who sees it almost as a home. Belmont properties also have some individuality. And Belmont have gone back to celebrating the actual property now over the brand. So now it's, instead of it being Belmont Cipriani, it's now Cipriani, a Belmont hotel, and very small letters underneath. And I think that very much reflects what people are looking for. They're not looking for chains. They're looking for individuality in the location. And I think part of that's because they really need to feel like when they go somewhere, it's worthwhile going there, that they're not going to somewhere that they could go anywhere else in the world, that the decor couldn't be anywhere else in the world except in this one place, that the artwork couldn't be anywhere else in the world except in this one place. These things we're constantly told in travel really matter to these people. And I think a lot of the time, product gets made at that sort of 5-star level, but it usually gets made for the high net worth tier, not for the very high net worth and ultra high net worth tier. And as a result, it turns off the very high net worth and ultra high net worth tier.
My best hotel experiences have been hotels owned by the ultra high net worth billionaires. And more of them seem to be investing in hotels and developing really characterful experiences and design and all the luxuries. I'm thinking of Heckfield Place in the UK, the art collection that Gerald Chan has assembled, or Larry Ellison's Porcupine Creek that have his personal art collection. I think that's right. Creating a sense of home and character and the personality of the owner of that home that you have the good fortune to stay in.
Even if you think about Urtka collection. So Urtka is owned by the Urtka family, and the properties are very individual. places like Hotel du Cap in Cap d'Antibes, it's Jumbie Bay in the Caribbean. They are individually spectacular properties, and they don't have that very depressing, constant corporate note through them. They're much more individual properties. And I think that's partly a reflection of the fact that this is a privately owned collection by the Oetker family, who made their wealth in other things and now have a lovely collection of hotels. And I think there is an insecurity or a belief amongst hotel brands that are run by the likes of Marriott, even when they're running luxury collection properties or St. Regis properties, that there has to be, that people are looking for that stamp, that people are looking for that sort of the Hiltonite sort of look of, oh, I have to be in a recognizable property. But a lot of very wealthy people who are recommended places by travel specialists, by their very well researched advisors
and friends,
they don't need to see the W above a hotel. They don't need to see St. Regis above a door. They don't need to see Ritz-Carlton above somewhere to feel like they're somewhere that's good enough to stay. They want somewhere that's much more special than that. And I think where brands like Aman do really well, even though Aman obviously now becoming much more of a brand with the products they're selling in the hotels and things like that, I think that Aman have managed to stay just the right side of chain because the properties are individually designed. They are very unique. They don't look like each other, and they don't look like the other hotels in that location. They're usually very low profile. Take Amangina in Marrakesh, for example. Aman Tokyo feels like a Japanese hotel. It doesn't feel like, an international class hotel. It feels like it's, of the place it's in.
I want to talk a little bit more about lifestyles of these people. And in fact, is it just me, or does it seem like there's heightened interest and fascination with upper class life these days in the mainstream media? You've got all these television series, right? We had Succession. Now there's Saltburn, Guy Ritchie's The Gentleman, maybe White Lotus to a lesser degree. What do you think that's about?
I think there's always really been a desire to live like the people who live above you. I'll clarify why I believe that. If you look at Evelyn Waugh's novel Vile Bodies, which was about the bright young things of the 1920s of London, the bright young things were wealthy society people who had everything on a plate, who could travel anywhere they wanted, go to lots of parties, they didn't have to work. They went to the right schools, they went to great universities, they had the latest fashions. They were basically tabloid fodder for people. People looked at their lives and they envied them. They wanted to be them. And I think a lot of that has come back really in the ways in which you pointed out with the TV series, Succession, White Lotus. There is this fascination, I think, that's always lurking beneath the surface in middle class society of what it would be like to be basically of a level where you don't have to think about when you spend money. You don't have to worry about the future. You don't have to worry about how you're going to afford college fees or school fees. You don't have to worry about whether you can afford to renew your car or not. You can travel any day of the week, any week of the month, any month of the year you want. And that sense of freedom that wealth brings, I think, brings a very special fascination from the middle class. I think it's always really been a sort of a bourgeois middle class ambition, sort of silent ambition to be in that class of person. There's such a mystique to that level of living.
Yeah.
There's such a mystique to it that it's very easy to be intoxicated by it. And I think it does happen throughout history.
This fascination with the upper class lifestyle is human nature, I guess. And there's even a word for it within a sociological framework. It's called upward social comparison. And that is when we deem someone else better off than we are, financially or otherwise. But ironically, in the case of these TV portrayals, they're not flattering in the least. The characters lead such miserable, drama-filled, wasteful lives that the counterweight is actually a downward social comparison, in which the viewer may take comfort in feeling morally superior and, in fact, happier. Which led to our discussion about what happens when people who grow up in middle class or lower income households suddenly become the nouveau riche. Where do they learn how to be rich? And how do they make that transition into what can feel like totally foreign terrain?
It's a very interesting one because they're not all as successful as each other in doing it. There are many wealthy people who make their fortune, particularly if you make your fortune well into maturity. So if you make it in your 50s, 60s, that kind of thing, you sell your company, you make the liquidity event, and you make, let's say that someone hypothetically made several hundred million, and suddenly that, wow, you're worth this much money. Usually, a lot of the time when you're at that level of wealth and you're at that level of maturity, not very much changes. You maybe get a slightly nicer car. You might get another property somewhere, maybe a holiday home somewhere. You probably definitely take a few more trips. If you were traveling premium economy or business, you maybe just always travel first. Maybe for some flights, you might even take a few private trips. But generally speaking, you don't suddenly see a huge amount of change overnight. And I think a lot of that is because at maturity, people start to feel a little bit less needful of externalizing wealth. When you see people make their money in their 30s, 20s and 30s and 40s, particularly if they're making their money in their 40s and they have other people that their kids, for example, who are much more impressionable, that can impact on their spending and on where they spend, on who they get connected with. Also, the people they marry. If they're married to someone very, who's their best friend, who's the same as them, they're less likely to sort of embrace that culture. Whereas if they marry someone who was always marrying someone who was potentially upwardly mobile, who was always going to want to, they're always going to want to take amazing holidays, they're always going to want to join that private club, they're always going to have one of those new friends. If they've married someone like that, then that's inevitably going to happen. It usually happens. The people closest to them tend to make them feel more comfortable in their new skin. So the kids say, "Dad, you should buy that Ferrari," or their spouse says, "Hey, you should buy me that gift now. You've got loads of money. You can buy me that pair of earrings. You can take me on that amazing trip." And the more they spend, the more they become comfortable with it. And because they spend more, they then expect more. And so the cycle begins and starts from there. That's usually the way into it. It tends to be the people closest to them. It's in some cases they might be people who do have that determination where as soon as they make 100 million, that's it. They're buying a yacht, going on around the world trip. They're buying a Ferrari. They might have set themselves these goals, but most of the time when people make their own money, they just don't really know what to do initially. And I think that what we tend to see much more of is people put themselves in the hands of advisors. So they might get to a point where they get older and they say, look, I actually need to have someone helping me out. I need to have a personal assistant. And the personal assistant might become very close to them and their family. They also might start to use their lawyer a little bit more than they used to before. Maybe their accountant is someone they frequently call. And all these little voices, these little chirps in their ear can be people who can start to influence the way in which they invest and the way in which they spend. I think a lot of these people do tend to make people feel more comfortable about their spending and about their sense of arrival. If you think about it before, I know this is going back to the Gilded Age again, but it is relevant because I think history is always important in these. Instead of just looking at contemporary life, we have to remember lots of things have happened before and will happen again. If you take someone like Ward McAllister, for example, who was Mrs. Astor's guardian of the 400, he was a person who decided who got into society or not. And he was a kind of an avuncular for newly wealthy people like the Vanderbilts to sort of be taken seriously eventually into old society. And I think you kind of have a little bit of that now. If you take, for example, Mukesh Ambani's son's recent wedding, where they invited lots of very, very wealthy people along to that wedding. And many of the people were writing about and talking about and were confused as to why some of those people were at Mukesh Ambani's son's wedding, because they seem to have very little to do with Reliance Industries in terms of their businesses. They just seem to be people who were worth over 50 billion, seem to be just a lot of just very, very extremely wealthy people. What possible connection could they have? But we've got to look at that in the context of something like a Mrs. Astor, in that if you get very powerful, very established, ultra wealthy names like Bill Gates, like Mark Zuckerberg to attend your wedding, these are global superstars of ultra high net worth wealth. If they attend your wedding and they get photographed at your wedding, it's kind of, you've arrived, you're welcomed into that circle, you're welcomed into that world. It's this sense of belonging, a sense of arrival is still there. But I think just with the newly wealthy people, it it really does depend. If you've come from absolutely nothing and you've only really made your money by when you're in your late 50s and 60s, your materialism is in serious decline. Your sense of externalizing your wealth is in serious decline. You don't need it that much.
I think as well, in addition to the people that surround you and influence you, I'm going to say that where you choose to live has a lot to do with it as well. You sell your business, you make a lot of money, and that second or third home you buy is in Palm Beach, or it's a farm in Vermont. The people that you're associating with are very, very different, and I think create a certain level of lifestyle expectation and habits that are just normal.
Absolutely. And a great example of that is if you take the industrialization of the United Kingdom in the 19th century, when the United Kingdom was the major global industrial power in the sort of early to mid 19th century, people who made industrial fortunes in the north of the country, north of England, would always, once they'd made that money, go and buy a grand palace townhouse in Mayfair and be part of society. And because they are around society, because they're invited to events of society, because they got to know society people, who they were invited to certain drawing rooms, certain dining rooms, they started to adopt their ways. And you're absolutely right. This has happened throughout history. If you locate yourself in New York and you're an internationally wealthy person from, let's say, India, you will start to adopt a lot of the practices of the international wealthy in New York if you spend enough time there. And I think that these citadels of wealth have become very popular. People have bought in they bought in the places where wealthy people tend to have second homes. So London, New York are really classic examples of that. And I think that creates a much more international sense of wealth amongst that group.
That was Winston Chesterfield of the Barton Group. And that 30-minute conversation should have been the end of season 5 of Serious Coin, because I typically do 6 episodes per season. But I found what Winston had to say so fascinating that we talked for over an hour. So I'm adding a bonus episode where we continue our conversation on luxury. What is luxury when nothing or almost nothing is beyond your means? And what brands are doing a good job of serving the luxury market? That's coming up next week. So make sure you're subscribed to the podcast so you don't miss it. Thanks for listening to Serious Coin. I'm Kelly Willis Green. Serious Coin is provided for your general interest only, and nothing we discuss should be taken as investment, tax, legal, or other professional advice. Always talk to a licensed professional before you make any financial decisions.